Okay, I think so. We are live. Hi, Mr. Shailendra here, and I'm joined here by Ollie. I'll call him Ollie. I think that's what I can pronounce correctly. Uh, uh, like we do this every month. We have another webinar where we brought in an expert who is going to talk about a topic that is very dear to him, which is how can engineering teams, young, mid-sized, large, can start implementing TDD effectively. TDD is a short form of test-driven development. The way we will run this webinar is that I'll start with a quick introduction of Ollie, and then Ollie has a fantastic template prepared that is going to run through in the next 20-25 minutes. And then if time permits, we'll keep the last 4 to 5 minutes open for questions if there are any. We'll try to wrap up this conversation in 30 minutes. Hi, Ollie. How are you?
Hi, Shailendra. I'm fine. Thanks a lot for having me.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I'm very glad that you accepted our invite to be part of this webinar. This webinar goes to about 3,000 plus developers and engineering managers that are part of the community across the planet. Most of these people are very, very curious in learning new concepts about making testing or generally, making software development easy, simple, and scalable. Ollie is essentially a full stack engineer based in Zurich, so he's joining from Zurich. He runs a meetup called Tech Conference, which organizes or they host. Uh, they organize a meetup every 2 weeks. So I think the end of the conversation, maybe you can check up Ollie a little and the good work he's doing around it. I'm the founder at HyperTest. I think people who've joined us again from some of the other webinars they attended, they know me already. So what Ollie would now explain to us, or maybe start by explaining to us, as I said, how can teams implement TDD effectively in their organizations? So the mic is all yours, Ollie.
Thanks a lot, Shailendra. So I probably need my slides, right?
Yeah.
So I termed this on effectively implementing TDD. So why do I term it like that? Well, it's a bit my experience, and of course, other people have other experiences, and I will just show how I think what could be missing or why teams struggle to implement TDD effectively. So let's get started. Again, my name is Ollie. That's perfect because nobody actually calls me Oliver. So Ollie is just fine. Again, full stack software engineer and so forth. So I'm also a technical trainer. And sometimes I try to coach on agile and technical practices. Yeah. So without further ado, let's get started. Why should we actually test at all? I mean, maybe we could say, well, testing is actually a waste of time. I mean, it's double the time to actually write tests. But if we look at this quite famous book, which is called Accelerate, we learned that high-performing teams actually automate their testing. So they integrate it also in their CD pipelines. And what they found is that actually testing correlates with fast delivery times, higher deployment frequency, reduced change failure rates, and quicker mean time to restore service. So all the fancy DORA metrics are met with testing. So the implication there is test early, test often, and as part of the continuous integration process. And if we go even a bit deeper into chapter 4 of Accelerate, there we actually also get TDD mentioned, and it's mentioned as an important practice because it forces developers to create more testable designs. So TDD seems to be something we should be doing actually quite a lot if we want to be a high-performing team. So why don't we do more TDD then? Because what I see is that TDD is still a practice that is more of a niche. So some people may do TDD, but entire teams or even the organizations do TDD. I have not seen that implemented that often. So
Right.
let's get started, right? So what is TDD then? I mean, we have already sometimes some misconceptions on TDD. So I call this red-green refactor cycle, this would be the unit test-driven development. So it's small-sized. We have the red part, which means write a little bit of test. And what I sometimes see is people think that you need to write the entire test suite before you start implementing, but that's not true. We should work in baby steps. So you write a little bit of test and you get it green. And not compiling actually already means that you have a failing test. And you do this red, green, red, green, red, green over and over again. And at some point you notice, well, maybe you need to improve your design. And then you refactor. That's also a misconception. You don't need to refactor all the time. Basically, you need to refactor when you have duplications or when you notice that the design that you have is actually not really maintainable anymore. So sometimes you can even do it like that. You implement it, and afterwards you basically inline all the abstractions you had, and then you start refactoring again once you have your test suite ready. Because you have the tests, you can do that very safely, which is another great reason why TDD is so effective. You have the tests and can do with the code whatever you want. But then the question is TDD actually an isolated practice? Because when you say, well, let's do TDD, a team might adopt TDD briefly, but then they stop again. So I want to explore a little bit of the context of TDD. And we can go basically one step out and ask ourselves, okay, what other TDD is there? Another TDD that is there is so-called acceptance test-driven development. So in acceptance test-driven development, we take our acceptance criteria and we basically turn them into executable specifications. So we start with a failing acceptance test, which is a business view on what needs to be implemented. And we do that because, well, the business is not all around. But when you do a change or add something, you want to still be sure that your software still runs as expected. So you cannot just call the business guy every time you commit, basically, and then, yeah, please run again my everything of the application to make sure that it still works. So we write the acceptance test and assume that this is how the software should run. And then we go into the code or start implementing the code with the unit TDD, and basically until the feature is done, and then our acceptance test is green. Of course, you can have any granularity in between acceptance test and unit test. Maybe you do also something like component test. But the gist here is that actually TDD should also be embedded in the larger acceptance test-driven development cycle. At
Makes
least
sense.
in my opinion.
Right. Absolutely makes sense. So generally, one question that I get asked by a lot of teams, Ollie, is that, well, obviously it's clear that TDD or the unit test are the most basic unit that needs to be in place before you start. Have you come across teams who understand the concept, start with acceptance style test, and then start writing unit test from purely from a starting perspective? And when they've not done anything, you've seen teams start with acceptance test and then go to unit test?
So yes, I have seen it. I mean, I do it myself. Pretty much every time I implement code, I start with something that I would consider an acceptance test, and then go into the code and do TDD on a unit test level. But it's very rare. So I mean, you need to be into this kind of basically genre of how to develop software to do it consistently. What is more often the case, in my opinion, is that people don't even know what TDD exactly is.
Right.
So
Right.
it's more of an exception if you find a team that consistently does TDD compared to not. Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
So now I said, well, there's acceptance test driven development. And in this context, well, okay, TDD apparently have two flavors, maybe more, but is that all now? And we can go actually a step further and look at the feedback loops of one of my favorite agile software development frameworks, I guess, which is called extreme programming. So we see here that actually the acceptance test and the unit test, so these two practices of ATDD and TDD, are embedded in a lot of loops of feedback loops to actually get the software written. So let's say, okay, we have a release plan, we have the iteration plan, that's all fine. But once you have the iteration plan and you have your stories or whatever kind of tasks you want to implement in place with the acceptance criteria, you will start with the acceptance test. And writing the acceptance test, then you will start implementing the software, which basically may or may not start with a
Mm.
stand up, but let's go one step further when we actually start implementing the software. And we see here it says pair negotiation. So
Mm.
modern software engineering may not only do pair negotiation like 25 years ago in XP, but we also have this called mob programming, ensemble programming. I call it team programming. So you could actually have more than two people negotiating with each other what needs to be implemented before you
Mm.
start implementing. And the cool thing about that is that when you negotiate before you write the test, then you have to think about what is actually the software afterwards going to do. So you also have to understand what is the business requirement. Why do we actually do what we do? And have we understood both the same thing of what we need to do? And by talking to each other and negotiating, we also align our mental models. And should we notice that actually there's something missing in our understanding, or we have completely diverging understandings, we can go back and ask somebody. So we need to go back, maybe in the stand up, maybe. I mean, the best thing would be if the business representative is readily available. So if they're on the side, or if you can call them immediately, that would be great. It would also be great if the person was actually sitting there. I mean, you cannot expect that from business people that they sit next to next to you while you implement the software. But it would be very a cool thing to actually do that, because then you can always clarify, is this what you want? And then it's a ping pong between business people and developer to actually implement the software. And only
Makes
then,
sense.
when you understand it, you can write a unit test. And this is also something that I hear often. I don't know where to start in testing or in test driven development. It's like, yeah, but shouldn't you know what you're going to implement? I mean, if you don't understand, or if you cannot write the test, maybe you have not understood the problem domain enough so that you can actually write the test. I mean, why would you write the code for a software you didn't really understand and only add the tests in hindsight? I mean, how large is the possibility that you actually implemented the right thing if you weren't even able to think about the first unit test or the test name, what it should actually do? And here, there's the other thing, that actually we had the pair negotiation before we write the test, but when we actually write the test and implement the software, we do again pair programming. So
Mm.
TDD is actually encapsulated between people that talk to each other, teamwork, and they talk in a business sense. So they are not thinking necessarily all the time about how the technical details work, but actually what is the business value that we provide? How can we actually test the system that we can prove that the software does what the business wants? So we
Right.
see here the unit test is, or the TDD and the ATDD are embedded in a framework. And let's ask ourselves, how many times actually do we have that? I mean, do we have TDD as an own practice where you only do TDD? You say, I do TDD now, okay. But do you also do other things? Do you do the pair programming all the time, or do you do it alone? I'm not sure if it could be that actually, if we don't embed it in that, that we have a not such a high chance that it actually succeeds and that people actually will continue TDD.
Makes sense. One quick question that comes to my mind, Ollie, is that I think you made it amply clear that before you even start writing code, you need to be clear as to what behavior you're trying to write code for.
Mhm.
And I think for that, business people need to be involved. And I think in India and everywhere else, that's what product managers are hired for. They basically become the bridge between developers and business people. How often? So I think you mentioned here the iteration plan, which I'm assuming is if the implementation changes or the discussed implementation or the discussed nature of the feature is not how the business people explained it to the team. How often do you keep involving the business people? Do you get all their requirements collected somewhere and then keep looking back at that document in case you want to iterate, or you make this like an open loop feedback loop of some sorts between the developers and the business people?
I mean, the best thing is if you have the developers talk directly to business, if that is possible, because of the implications. You will build the trust between the people if they know each
Mm,
other. It's that
right.
simple. People that know each
Mm,
other trust each other. So business people are much more likely to tell you, well, yeah, I trust that you do the right thing. If you say TDD is what we need to do, I completely trust you. I don't know how to develop software. I only know the domain. So please do that. The problem is when you have this telephone game. Somebody talks to somebody else, and back and forth, and somebody writes it down with their mindset and their mental model. Then it's always a subjective thing. So you never know if the person that reads the document and then writes the code for it actually has understood the same thing as the person
makes
who
sense.
wrote it down. So the
Mm,
closer
mm,
the interaction, the better. If you can make that, yes, then it's even better. If you need a person in between, I mean, sometimes you have lots of stakeholders and they have diverging interests and goals. Then you need somebody in between the development team and the actual business to delegate what is actually the most important thing to do, and that's where a
makes
PO,
sense.
for example, comes in. Yeah.
Perfect sense. Makes sense. And what could be what is the ideal size of the developer team that can practice extreme programming?
Oh, I would say the same as for Scrum. I mean, it's like 7 plus minus 2. It's 6 plus minus
Mm.
3. I mean, you need at least two people to work together.
Right,
So
right.
I would not go below that, but anything else, I mean, don't go above 9, 10. I mean, that's certain, because the problem is the
Mm.
larger the team, the more fragmented the tasks become, because you typically cannot work on the same overall goal. So then you probably would start splitting the team in two instead to make it smaller. So
Makes sense.
extreme programming, the same as Scrum, is for small teams. It's not for large teams. Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I forgot that one. The code should actually
Mm.
represent the business as well. So that's why we have the so-called long name business domain-driven software design, which is abbreviated to domain-driven design, which is DDD. So basically, anything from start to code should
Mm.
look the same. You should have the same mental model when you talk about the business thing that you actually want to automate.
Makes sense.
That's what I just said. So TDD describes the system behavior from a business perspective. So if you use TDD for basically technical, you only have a technical view when you implement something. It might not be that effective, and
Makes sense.
you might drop it at some point. And again, TDD is very deeply embedded in these teamwork practices. So we
Mm.
need teamwork, we need feedback loops to actually develop software which is complex. So stuff that can be misunderstood. And we are not very good at formulating stuff. So we need to talk to each other basically all the time.
Right.
And sometimes I get then the question, can we do TDD in, I call it Scrum Fall, because that's what we typically see. It's a waterfall with fancy Scrum terms. And
Mhm.
Well, when it comes to that, I say yes, of course you can, but there are quite some questions you actually can ask yourself. So, I mean, this comes again. Lots of things come also from XP. I mean, can you maintain a sustainable pace of work? So
Mm.
I see that when you are under pressure, or a business wants to have a specific deadline when something is delivered, and you will start to abandon anything that you did before when you were not stressed. So will you write tests? Well, probably not. Will you do TDD? Never. So pair programming goes out the window, and anything that you can do to save time in the short term, you will do. So TDD is one of the first things to go, because TDD is perceived as slower. And if management pushes like, yeah, this is too slow, we need to get features, give me features, then you will not do TDD anymore. TDD is for
Right.
learning. The same is true for stuff like, can you actually get feedback? So when you want to ask somebody, hey, how does this work? Do you get constructive feedback, or do you get something like, well, it's written in that document? It's like, yeah, no, but I mean, then you will stop actually asking questions. And this goes into the same direction as psychological safety. So are you feeling like you can raise issues, that you can ask questions, or is it more like you were labeled as stupid if you ask questions, which is something I often see. So if you have something like that, you might do TDD, but do you get the feedback to actually say if you have implemented the right thing, if you can never ask? So the effectiveness of TDD is reduced, so that at some point you might say, well, let's not do TDD. Let's start with the implementation, write the test later, because there is no gain actually in using TDD. And the same again with business representative. If you never see them, well, you cannot ask questions, and then you implement something that has nothing to do with what they wanted. And for the teams themselves, are they interested in learning about the business domain? Because a lot of software engineering, what it is about, is actually about learning about the business domain and applying and creating software solution for that. You don't need to be the absolute domain expert, but you need to have an interest in learning, else TDD might not be effective, because you would write only technical tests that don't actually have much value in the grander scheme of that. And it goes further. I mean, these are just some examples. And all I want to say with that, if you have not this environment, you can have sometimes Scrum falls that have an environment which resembles more of a Scrum or an Agile development, at least inside your team. If you don't have that, then TDD more likely fails than not. But
Right.
if you have, I mean, you can have Scrum fall and deadlines and everything. But if you have a good Scrum Master, for example, or somebody that shields you from the outside world, and your team can basically implement things themselves and can do this feedback-driven development, then actually it might still survive. The pressure will push TDD out, in my opinion, or in my experience.
Do you feel this question gets asked a lot of times, and I think you probably pointed out why engineering managers try pushing off from TDD as much as possible. Does practicing TDD really slow down teams, or is just the teams that don't know how to practice it properly essentially get slowed down, or at least have the perception that they're getting slowed down?
So TDD might slow you down in the beginning when you get started on it.
Mm.
But the thing about software engineering is not necessarily the speed, it's more the predictability. So if you, for example, can get lots of features in the first month, and then all of a sudden it gets longer and longer and longer, and all your estimations go up and up and up, and business is like, what the hell is happening? In the beginning you brought so many features, and now it takes weeks for a checkbox to change. I mean, then probably if you had TDD from the start, you have your tests, you have a good design. So this design should actually be easy to change. I mean, that's the whole point about agile software development, that you can respond to changes. Then you stay predictable. So if it took a certain amount of time in the beginning, also half a year later, it should take more or less the same time to implement a feature of the same size as the beginning. I mean, you still have the added complexity, of course, the essential complexity, which you cannot get rid of, and it takes a little bit longer. But it shouldn't be like exponentially more expensive to do it half a year later than before.
Right.
So as a manager, I would like to have a predictable software development cycle. So I don't want to have it fast if afterwards I get nothing at all, or it costs me a fortune to change something. So
Right.
TDD, in my opinion, will provide you with that advantage that you actually can continue implementing feature and changing things, which if you don't test or write the test afterwards, maybe it works, maybe not. What I have seen is that typically if you don't do testing or TDD, and if you don't practice refactoring, which is also part of TDD, then your software will deteriorate so fast that your productivity goes, you will not be able to implement anything anymore.
Makes sense. Go ahead. Yeah.
So the context is basically where TDD shines. And before I showed the feedback loops, and now I want to show TDD in the context of the practices. These practices are also part of extreme programming again, and there are stuff that you have in Scrum too, but here it's like an explicit way of developing software. So software development is an integral part of extreme programming. It is made for it. So you have the acceptance test, you have the TDD, which works with pair programming, refactoring, and simple design. You have the continuous integration, by the way, 25 years ago. So it's nothing new, small releases. The metaphor is something like the ubiquitous language from domain-driven design. And all these kind of things need to be in place so that test-driven development actually can strive. If you don't have that, well, it's probably going to be a little bit of an issue for test-driven development to somehow survive. So I argue that if the closer your work environment actually is to an extreme programming style or an extreme programming similar environment, the better are the chances for TDD to strive and survive. And I like to compare that to the penguin in the desert. If you only take one practice out of XP, TDD, because you want to do TDD, and then you want it to survive in your team, if you have a real waterfall with tight deadlines and everything we talked about, I assume it's going to be quite hard to actually adopt TDD for a longer time.
Makes sense.
Do we still have some time?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So sometimes you hear people say, but we do real Scrum. So not the Scrum fast style, but we actually do an agile software development with Scrum. Isn't that enough? And to that, I can say, well, let's look at chapter 4 of Accelerate again. It's a great book, by the way. If you haven't read it, you should all read that book. So we see down here that many agile adoptions have treated technical practices as secondary compared to the management and team practices. So our research shows that technical practices play a vital role in achieving these outcomes. So extreme programming has these technical practices, whilst for stuff like Scrum got so watered down over the last couple of years that you can basically apply it to running a church. It is not focused on developing software anymore, but inherently it's a method to develop software. It's a method to solve complex, unpredictable problems, because you build an increment, you get feedback on it, and then you iterate. That's the main idea about Scrum, which is the same in XP. But you can apply it to any complex problems. And if you want to actually do or implement TDD and all the technical practices that need to be in place to do it, you can basically look at extreme programming when you are in Scrum and take all the missing practices, which are the technical practices, but also other practices like the metaphor, which is also present in domain-driven design. So as soon as you do domain-driven design, then you need to have the practices from extreme programming. These things are so tightly coupled together, that you cannot do it without each other. So Agile software development works very well with TDD, with DDD, with all these kind of techniques. And so Scrum for me is a great way to start. If it's really implemented as it should be, yes, you can, of course, implement TDD in Scrum as well, if you implement also other missing practices, so that TDD gets tightly coupled and embedded in these processes.
Makes sense.
And this is really the right context, then TDD will strive.
Right. Oh,
Maybe
the DORA.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe some
Right,
words
right.
on that. I mean, the problem sometimes is, how do I persuade teams and management to actually adopt something like TDD, which is part of XP? So basically adopt XP. And I assume that these measures, if you can show that you can actually improve any of these measures, you can actually show that and say, look, this is because we changed to, let's say, real agile development without this waterfall style development, we could actually improve these. Who would say no? I mean, if you show that it works, of course, people will adopt it more. The problem is we measure too little, or it's hard actually to measure what works and what not. And but without indicators, there's no way we can adopt it in more of its entirety. So show that you can improve these measures, and I guess you have a higher chance to actually implement TDD in your team or organization.
Makes sense.
And maybe a last word also on how to get there. It's always, I mean, this is actually an agile software development feedback loop. So you plan, you implement, you get feedback, and you iterate. But it's exactly the same with implementing XP, for example, or TDD. You do a little bit. You start with, maybe you do TDD for 2 hours or so, and then you see if that works. Maybe you do pair programming for 2 hours and see how it works, and then you get a feedback from your colleagues, and then you iterate. Maybe you need to adopt it, and then from small to larger, and then start adopting all the practices that are needed, and then you have a higher chance of TDD to stick, because people are habit focused or habit driven. So you need to create new habits, and habits sometimes, if you want to go to the gym, can mean that in the beginning you basically take out your clothes and you don't even go to the gym, but only already the practice of taking out clothes to go to the gym is the first tiny step towards the goal. And then you start, at some point you go to the gym, and you might go there and not even go into the gym, but you need to get into this habit of changing things. And this is universally true, and I think it also works in that sense. The problem, of course, is people that push against it, but sometimes it's also fear, and the smaller the change at the time, the smaller the fear that the change will actually have an unexpected, strange impact. And if you find that something doesn't work, well, then iterate, try something else.
Yeah, that's true.
So maybe my brief summary for everybody who still is listening. So you need to embed TDD in your process, and XP is one of the most most effective ways of embedding TDD, also ATDD, which are basically should always come together. And the further away you are from this ideal, the harder, in my opinion, it gets for TDD to strive and be adopted.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
And again, TDD, like changing anything in the organization, takes time. Do it in baby steps. What works for me quite well is declaring time-limited experiments, because people or business or management are quite open, in my opinion, to small experiments if they don't take up too long. So if you can get like 2 weeks and experiment with it and gather some feedback, then you already know, does it actually work? Will I get my team to do something like TDD? And then you have a better chance compared to saying, well, let's change the entire process we have to XP. I mean, nobody will listen to you. They will say, no, that's not going to happen. And
Right.
and then measure stuff. Again, take Dora metrics, take something else that you want to improve, and measure it. Measure it before you do it and measure it afterwards, and see if you can actually show a change. And sometimes you need more time. So, well, get more time if that's possible. But without measuring stuff, it's going to be hard to persuade people that what you're doing is better than before.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
And I think the best thing to remember, if you want to remember anything from what I just said, is the penguin in the desert. Don't try to do TDD all alone on your own, but actually try to incorporate other practices as well. Try to incorporate especially pair programming and teamwork and collaboration and a feedback culture in your team. And then TDD looks much more reasonable, as the tests that you produce actually read, if you do it well, they read in business language. So actually business people can read through them and understand them, and that builds trust, and then they might be open for you to actually also adopt more practices if they see that what you produce is of good quality.
Makes sense. Okay. All right. Okay. I think we are at the end of the presentation, I'm assuming, Oli, right? Or this is the last slide. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So I think thanks for this absolutely great presentation, Oli. And I think from my experience, I can say, although any teams that choose to practice extreme programming and incorporate ATDD and TDD, essentially, on a longer time frame, end up seeing lesser technical debt in their code and also have a better developer morale. So a lot of engineering managers would appreciate that getting talented developers to join your team is far easy, maybe at the initial start, if you give them a good salary, a good bump in salary from their last job, but retaining them is that much harder. So unless you have an environment in which your code is cleaner, it is easy to maintain it, there are higher chances that you'll be able to retain these really smart engineers that you've hired, because teams that don't have the kind of environment where their code is easily maintainable usually have devs which burn out, have low morale, and eventually leave. And a lot of engineering managers, smart engineering managers who are leading high performance teams would realize that having or retaining high quality talent is paramount to having a quality software. So I think this sort of sets up really nicely on why teams should be motivated to practice extreme programming and TDD. And this is one of the reasons we ended up building a tool for teams that don't get to practice TDD or extreme programming. Although what we're doing with HyperTest is no way a replacement of TDD or ATDD, but teams that don't end up writing tests, or teams that have developers end up writing tests like you said, before they even uh, start writing code, generally at some point realize that they've built a lot of software which is now completely untestable. And we felt that a good way to solve that is to give them some form of test built outside in, basically from actual user flows, or which are very closer to, as you said, the behavior or the actual business specification. Although this is much difficult than, or doing TDD is much simpler than having these kind of tests, but we made a good attempt at it. We essentially generate component style test as well as test that, as I said, test your code outside in. So I think people who've attended this webinar before know about HyperTest enough, and please feel free to go out and check the work that we're doing. And I think we've finished time within probably 10 minutes overboard. So I'll thank Ollie again for taking out time and participating in this webinar. He's joining us from Zurich, and this has been enlightening conversation. Those who have not joined, they already know that we'll circulate the recording of the webinar over an email, so you can go through it at your own time. I don't think we have any questions at this stage from anybody. So I think we'll probably end it and end on that note. And thank Ollie again. Thank you, Oliver. I'd sort of
Thanks a
say it
lot
that
for
way
having
for
me.
joining. And yeah, let's keep in touch. And it was fun having you here. And I'm pretty sure the people who will listen to the recording, or the ones that you attended, would have gotten something out of it. Thank you.
Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Ollie.
Yeah,
Thank you.
was
Take
fun.
care.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.